At 2100 hours on the night of May the 9th, 1940, the code word Danzig was flashed to all army divisions ranged along Germany's western borders. For around 3 million men, the moment they had been training for had come. The invasion of Western Europe had begun. The phony war was now over. In the early hours of May the 10th, nearly 30 divisions of Army Group B crossed the border and advanced into Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. Luxembourg soon fell, but the armies of Belgium and Holland were not about to stand aside. Both Belgium and Holland were neutral countries, and no declaration of war was made until the actual invasion began. Holland, in particular, had strictly followed its policy of neutrality. A lack of investment meant that it had a very small standing army and few tanks. But the landscape was also crisscrossed with waterways. This was supposed to provide an effective defense network, as they could flood the low-lying area. In the event, the Germans simply bypassed these obstacles or created new improvised crossings. Also, the invaders in this part of the campaign were not of the same caliber as the highly trained and mobile units of the panzer divisions that were soon to follow. The German attack through Holland was intended to be a feint in order to lure the British and French forces north. Supporting Army Group B were nearly 2,500 combat transport and glider aircraft. As detailed reconnaissance had been carried out, the Luftwaffe was able to quickly destroy the Dutch and Belgian air forces and establish complete air superiority within the first 24 hours of the invasion. A decisive factor in the invasion's early stages was the deployment of paratroopers and glider-borne infantry. They landed far ahead of the infantry and were tasked with seizing and holding airfields and bridges until they could be relieved by the advancing forces. The fort at Eben-Amel on the Albert Canal in Belgium was a key defensive position. Paratroopers and gliders landed right on top of the fort, taking the defenders by surprise. This was the first time anywhere in the world that airborne forces had seen action. It was also the first time that hollow charge explosives were used to blast through the casemates. Once the fort fell, the route into central Belgium was clear. Strategically, it was important for the Germans to take Holland out of the war as quickly as possible. This would then deny the Allies a valuable foothold on the continent from which they could threaten Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr Valley. Confusion was sown in the minds of the Dutch when German bombers overflew the country before turning back out over the North Sea and beginning their bombing runs from the west. Meanwhile, the airborne landings were having mixed success. The paratroops were unable to secure the main airfield at Yperburg near The Hague, seat of the Dutch government. As a result, many transports were lost or dispersed. Around Rotterdam, things were going better. The Germans had landed seaplanes loaded with troops near the city centre, from which they were able to secure a bridgehead. This position became stronger following the taking of an airfield to the south of the city. More troops were then sent to link up with the paratroops in the city. But progress was slow, and not all the bridges were intact. Holland was an irritation in the great scheme of the attack on France. The sooner the Germans could take out Holland, the sooner they could concentrate all their resources on France. But the Dutch defenders of Rotterdam were proving difficult to dislodge. For this reason, they wanted to shock the Dutch politicians into surrendering. Rotterdam was to pay the price. The Germans decided to launch a ferocious attack on Rotterdam that would have such an impact that the government of Holland would initiate a surrender. On May the 14th, the attack on Rotterdam started, even though surrender negotiations had already started. Despite all their heroics, the Dutch Air Force had lost 62 aircraft out of 125 on May the 10th alone. Despite such losses, they continued attacking the Germans and inflicting damage right up until Holland surrendered. For their valour, the Dutch Air Force was awarded the Militair Willemforce, the Dutch equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Eventually, around 100 tons of bombs were dropped, destroying around a square mile of the medieval city centre and killing some 1,000 civilians. A further 80,000 were made homeless. The incident led to the immediate surrender of Rotterdam, and very shortly afterwards, the Dutch government decided they could not risk other cities being bombed and sought an armistice. Although the invasion had been expected, its timing caught the British by surprise. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had just resigned following a disastrous campaign in Norway in which around 4,000 men had been lost. On May the 10th, a new wartime coalition government was formed, led by Winston Churchill. In the meantime, the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, had arrived in France in September 1939 under the command of General Gort, and had taken up their positions on the French-Belgian border as part of the Allied First Army Group. Following the invasion, the BEF began its advance into Belgium to take up its positions along the River Dyle as had been planned. On their immediate left was the Belgian army, and the French First Army on its right, as well as two mechanised divisions. But the inability of the French First Army to stall the Germans long enough in Holland meant that there was a danger that the Allies' flank could be exposed before the armies were properly dug in. The Germans, meanwhile, had drafted in two panzer divisions to increase the power of Army Group B. Between them, the two divisions could field around 620 tanks. The majority of their tanks were light Panzer Mark 1s and 2s, which were no match for the French tanks like the Saumur 35. Even the gun of the main battle tank, the Panzer Mark III, could not penetrate the armour of the S-35s. In fact, the only tank the Germans had at this point that was capable of holding its own in a tank versus tank confrontation was the Panzer Mark IV. But they only had 52 of these. In accordance with French doctrine, the tanks were deployed along a defensive line, with the village of Hanout in the middle. The terrain here is open plain, ideal for tanks and motorised infantry, and so it was vital the French armour stop them. The stage was set for what was, up to that point, the largest tank battle in history. On May the 12th, the German panzers broke through the Dutch and Belgian defences and charged towards the French tanks. Over the next 3 days, nearly 1,200 tanks battled it out to gain control of the Belgian plain. French doctrine saw the tanks strung out in long lines, while the Germans concentrated theirs in order to punch holes in the defenders' lines. The German tank crews could fight the French tanks only with personal resolution and courage by flanking them and attacking weak points to their sides and rears. Due to the inferior firepower and armour on most of their tanks, the Germans suffered heavily. 160 German tanks were destroyed by French tanks. However, because the Germans took control of the battlefield in the end, most of their damaged and destroyed tanks were repaired and sent back into service. Wireless was another key to German success. German tanks had radio receivers that allowed them to be directed by platoon command tanks, which in turn had voice communication with other units. Wireless allowed tactical control and far quicker improvisation than their opponents. Radio allowed German commanders to coordinate their formations, bringing them together to create greater firepower, whether it was in attack or defence. Most French tanks also lacked radio. Orders between infantry units were typically passed by telephone or verbally. The combat effectiveness of German armour was much higher as well, because their tanks were manned by 5 crewmen. This reduced reaction time and spread out the stress placed on the tank crews. The French, on the other hand, stressed the importance of armour over mobility. Their vehicles were more suited to static defence. Although their heavy armour gave the German tank crews plenty of grief, they lost strategically because the Germans could control the battlefield and outflank them at every juncture. The French lost 30 S-35 tanks in this battle, some of which were abandoned by their crews because they ran out of fuel. The insufficient combat radius was the main weakness in French tanks, but they managed to delay the German advance and bought the Allies valuable time.